Hi, friends. This series is called But on Sunday. And in it, I'm going to share some thoughts about scripture that's a part of the lectionary that I think in some ways might correlate with some of the things we see happening in our communities right now. Now, as a reminder, I'm going to talk about Jesus because that's my faith tradition. But as always, I truly and completely believe that our communal capacity for love, empathy, and kindness transcends my faith tradition and extends to yours. It also extends to you even if you aren't someone who ever identified with a faith tradition in any way, shape, or form. So, because of that, as you watch, I just ask that you find yourself in the story. Think of the characters as living, breathing examples of people you might know or situations you might have experienced. Because all week long, we fight for one another. But on Sunday, we also remember. Now, in John 11, we encounter a story that feels deeply familiar: a grieving family, a delayed response, and a world that seems to have already decided the outcome. Lazarus is dead, and Mary and Martha are heartbroken. And Jesus, strangely, waits. And that detail matters because if we're honest, we live in a time that also feels like waiting for justice, waiting for peace, waiting for changes in systems that seem as sealed and immovable as a tomb. And we cry out, like Martha did, Lord, if you had just been here. If you had just been here, maybe the violence would have stopped. If you had just been here, maybe the policies would have been different. If you had just been here, maybe our communities wouldn't feel so buried under grief and fear. But Jesus doesn't rush to prevent death. Instead, he enters into it. Now, when Jesus finally arrives, he doesn't offer quick answers or distant theology. He asks questions and he listens. And then he cries. Jesus wept. The shortest verse in scripture may also be one of the most revealing because God doesn't stand apart from suffering. God is not indifferent to human pain. God is deeply moved by it, emotionally and spiritually and bodily. And that should shape how we understand faith in a political and in a social world. Because a faith that ignores suffering isn't the faith of Jesus. And a faith that avoids grief is not the faith of resurrection. A faith that refuses to see injustice is not the faith that calls the dead back to life. Jesus stands at the tomb and weeps, not just for Lazarus, but for a world where death and loss and injustice feel final. He weeps for systems that crush people. He weeps for communities that are divided and for those who feel forgotten. And then something radical happens. Jesus says, "Take away the stone." Now, notice how Jesus does not move the stone himself. He invites the community to do it. And I think this is where the story becomes deeply political, not in a partisan sense, but in a sense of shared responsibility for how we live together. See, resurrection isn't passive. It requires participation. We are the ones called to roll away the stones. Stones of inequality that keep opportunities out of reach for others. Stones of systemic racism that deny dignity and safety. Stones of economic hardship that trap families in cycles of survival. And those of exclusion that tell people because of who they are or who they love that they don't belong. And let's be honest, those stones are heavy. They are reinforced by laws, by traditions, by structures of power, by fear, and they are not easily moved. But Jesus doesn't ask us whether the stone is heavy. He asks whether we're willing. Martha hesitates. She says, "Lord, already there is a stench because he has been dead for 4 days. In other words, This situation has gone too far. I'm out. And don't we say the same thing today? The system is too broken. The division is too deep. The injustice has gone on too long. There is no fixing this. But resurrection doesn't depend on our assessment of what is salvageable. It depends on God's power to bring life out of death and our willingness to trust that power is enough to act. Jesus says, "Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God?" And then he calls out with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." This is not just a miracle. It's a public act of defiance against death itself. It's a declaration that what seems final is not ultimate, and that what has been buried can still rise. And Lazarus comes out, still wrapped in his burial clothes, alive, but not yet free. And so Jesus gives one more command: unbind him and let him go. And this is crucial because resurrection is not complete until the community participates in its liberation. Lazarus walks out of the tomb, but he cannot fully live until others help remove what still restricts him. His new life requires community. And friends, this is where we live today. We're surrounded by people who are alive, but still bound. Bound by injustice, bound by systems that limit access to healthcare, bound by underfunded schools and unequal opportunities, discrimination that shapes who is safe and who is not, police and policies that profit over people. And Jesus is still calling, unbind them. Not someday, not in theory, now. This is where our faith meets action. And it's not enough to celebrate resurrection on Sunday and ignore suffering on Monday. It is not enough to speak of hope while policies harm the vulnerable, or to pray for change while refusing to actually participate in it. The gospel calls us to something deeper, something riskier, more faithful. It calls us to stand at the tombs of our time and refuse to accept death as the final word. It calls us to weep with those who weep and then act in solidarity with them. It calls us to challenge systems that benefit some at the expense of others. It causes us to care about healthcare because bodies matter, to care about housing because dignity matters, to care about justice because every person bears the image of God. And not because these political talking points are things that we should pay attention to because they matter, but because they are the work of resurrection. And sure, this is going to be uncomfortable. Rolling stones away disrupt the status quo. Unbinding people challenge systems of control. And calling the dead to life threatens those who benefit from their death. In fact, if you read what comes next in John's gospel, this miracle becomes the tipping point that leads to the plot against Jesus. Because resurrection is dangerous. It exposes injustice. It reorders power. It refuses to accept that death, whether physical or social or systemic, gets the final say. And so what does this mean for us? It means we can't be neutral in the face of suffering. And we can't turn away from the tombs in our world. We're not just called to believe in resurrection, but to participate in it. To roll away stones even when it's hard. To unbind those still wrapped in grave clothes. And maybe, just maybe, we'll begin to see what Jesus promised. that even in a world that feels buried, life is still possible. Even in a time of division, community can still be formed. And even in the face of death, literal and systemic, resurrection is still breaking through. So hear this good news. The tomb is not the end. The bound can be set free. Lazarus, come out. And equally, to us as community, unbind him and let him go. Peace be with you, friends.